10 households will receive more than what they paid out in terms of consumption. That's now. But will that be the same thing in 2030, 2031? We think that it will be the same thing. Even though the amounts increase, the structure remains the same. So there was no major change in terms of the carbon tax. I can tell you that we will probably update our reply in terms of the distributive analysis. Because it will have to be added to it compared to our previous report. There will be adjustments then for the carbon tax and for housing, house heating, home heating. But I don't think there should be a significant change in terms of the tax if the structure remains the same. But is it nonetheless true that if you think about the GST that's paid on the carbon tax, will the amounts remain the same? Will there be a change now, or between now and 2030, 31? There shouldn't be a change. So the tax upon tax has already been included in our analysis of the GST. Well, a tax on a tax. Wouldn't it be simpler, fiscally speaking, just to manage a tax, any tax, which dealt directly with the initial amount and not a tax upon a tax? You're looking at the interest of that tax upon tax. Clearly, it's something that greatly irritates many consumers. Quebecers have been living through that over the past years, and a tax added to the GST. So that is something that could affect the amount rather than just having a tax upon a whole amount.
Correct. Over to you again, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Giroux, I dug into the tracking tables that you provide, which are very helpful, connecting the supplementary estimates to the various budget commitments that the government's made. And I notice, I believe there's, if I'm reading this correctly, there's $10 million in supplementary estimate C for 23-24 for implementing the National Action Plan to end the tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This is an issue that has a tremendous impact in the region that I represent. And I'm curious about the number, if I'm reading that correctly, whether it's supplemented by any other financial commitments by the government, or whether in fact that represents the government's annual investment in that very important work.
It's a question that we'll probably have to get back to you on, because we have the supplementary estimates here, but we don't have the overall government spending for the year 2023-24, and certainly not by that level of detail by program. But I would think that there's more to it, and that sub C, the amount that you mentioned, is only in addition to what the government plans on spending for this, because the fiscal year is drawing to an end. So it would be very surprising if that was the only amount on that specific initiative.
Okay, thank you. And I was noticing in your report, switching to a different topic, on the student loan changes and the financial impacts of those, waiving the interest on student loans, you see the number of loan write-offs declining over time. But I also noticed that there's quite a spike in write-offs, I believe, between 21-22 and 22-23. And I'm just wondering if you can, this is the figure 2.5, there's a graph there. And between 21-22 and it looks like 22-23, the number of write-offs seems to have spiked fairly considerably. I'm just wondering if that's related to the pandemic, or what effect we're seeing there.
I think there's the pandemic played a part because the government made some policy decisions to suspend some repayments during the pandemic. But there's also an inherent volatility in decisions to write off because it depends on recovery activity and repayment and how certain economic conditions can affect. So there's always some volatility in write-offs and repayment because of the trigger that can be triggered or not, like the decision points. So there's always volatility in programs like that when it comes to writing off debt that is deemed unrecoverable.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jenless,
Thank you, Mr.
please.
Chair.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Giroux, for your excellent work. My colleagues asked some important questions about the government's Arrive scam scandal and the costs associated with that. When talking to people about this scandal who are involved in government, one point of feedback I often get is this is just the tip of the iceberg. People see the ballooning of contracting out, the number of firms involved in so-called staff augmentation and middlemen. I wonder if you could help us get a sense of the magnitude of contracting out in general. And I'll ask some specific questions related to pieces of that. But how much are we spending in a given year on contracting out functions of public service delivery?
So to give you an order of magnitude, we estimate that there's about $21 billion in contracting out. So that includes, obviously, consultant fees, consultant services, but it also includes assistance or professional services that are not available in the public service. For example, if you're building warships, you don't necessarily expect all of the expertise to be available at the Department of National Defense.
Can I just jump in
Sure.
on that? Because I was thinking through kind of what are the instances of contracting out that maybe seem more plausible and legitimate and the ones that seem less plausible and legitimate. So the typology I came up with is let's put it in three buckets. Let's say hard tasks, so specific hard tasks that the government says we just don't have people who know how to do that within government. That's one bucket. And then another bucket might be management consulting. So the work this committee's done on McKinsey, for example, where people are brought in to offer general advice on direction, management consulting. And then the third would be pure middlemen, so people who are hired to hire other people, like GC Strategies. So within that $21 billion in contracting out, could you try to give us a sense of the magnitude of each bucket?
So looking at what you laid out in terms of categories, I'd say the vast majority are probably what one would describe as hard tasks. For example, the expertise that the public service doesn't have, or services that are needed to contract out to provide health services to remote First Nations communities. Consulting services would probably be much lower. $1 billion or $2 billion. I don't know the exact numbers. And the pure middlemen.
And I'll just jump in and we can go back and forth.
Sure.
I mean, $1 billion or $2 billion is smaller than the total of 21 billion, but $1 billion or $2 billion is still a lot of money. So can you give us a sense, of when you say a lower proportion, what kinds of amounts we'd be talking about for those management consulting and those middleman kind of buckets?
So the management consulting or the consulting services, we have done a report that indicated the broad categories, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but what I remember is it was about 10% of the overall total, maybe less. And the pure middlemen, there was no such category because they could be embedded in all of these categories if, for example, somebody who wins a contract then turns around and subcontracted to somebody else. So it's very difficult to figure out the proportion that would be pure middlemen as you name
Right.
that category.
And I guess this speaks to the lack of proper records, right? So with the Arrive scam issue specifically, the Auditor General's estimate is we're looking at close to 20 billion went to GC Strategies. They didn't apply any hard skills. We have I think close to $8 billion went to Dalian, that's already half of the total, and those are areas where we know there were no hard skills applied. So I guess to summarize what you said, this government is spending about $21 billion in contracting out, 2.1 billion of which is going to that kind of management consulting category, and the middlemen category is a black box. We don't know. Is that?
I wouldn't bet my salary on the $2.1 billion.
Right, okay.
That's off memory. And the pure middleman is...
Well, in this government, you
guess.
get a bonus regardless of how good a job you do, so you don't have to worry about it. I'm just joking. But sir, the numbers here are I think quite striking, because we hear this narrative from the Liberals across who say, it's any cut, any reduction in spending is going to impact service delivery. But this clearly shows that there's waste within government, contracting out for things that we don't need to be contracting out. And I thank you for your time. Anything you want to follow up on that, I'd appreciate.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Atwood, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Giroux, for joining us, as always. I'm going to return to some of the questions that my colleague, Mr. Bachrach, asked around Indigenous Services Canada. I have a particular vested interest in this piece. And so first, I'd just like to highlight for anyone at home or for anyone who's not familiar with Jordan's principle, it's certainly critical for ensuring that we're filling any of those jurisdictional gaps among provincial and federal governments for child and family services for Indigenous peoples across the country. And so very important investment, very proud of this on behalf of the government. But I'd like to ask you specifically, Mr. Giroux, have you noticed an increase in spending for Indigenous Services Canada over the last couple of years?
Yes, in fact, a very sharp increase over time on spending for Indigenous services. If memory serves me well, and it's usually not a very good indicator, but it's gone from about $18 billion in 21-22, and it's scheduled to reach, or it's reached, 47.5 in the current fiscal year, 23-24. So a significant increase in spending for Indigenous services.
Excellent, thank you. And in your analysis, you mentioned that a large amount of proposed spending relates to Indigenous claims. Can you elaborate on that? And also, how does this compare to years past?
So Indigenous claims are claims that are made by Indigenous groups against the Crown for wrongdoings, past wrongdoings. And the government has made it clear that it wants to settle as many as these claims as possible. So it's shown an openness to settling some of these claims. So as a result, the government had to set aside money to settle the claims. And I don't have the exact amounts of money specifically set aside for settling claims, but it's something that we can provide in writing at a later point.
Great, thank you very much. And just again, a general comment from me around my role as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada in protecting service delivery, of course, for communities across the country. I'd like to switch a little bit now. A general question I think most Canadians are really looking for the answer to would be, can you comment on when you believe inflation will reach the target rate of 2%?
So it's an interesting question, and one that we've been asked quite often. We released our economic and fiscal outlook a couple of weeks ago, and based on what we see on the economic front with economic data, notably with the decrease in global commodity prices, we expect that the inflation rate should return to its 2% target level by the end of the current year, calendar year, which would allow the Bank of Canada, to start reducing its interest rate. So we believe that economic conditions would be sufficient to allow the bank to start decreasing its rate in April. It may choose to wait a bit to be on the safe side to ensure that all inflationary pressures have subsided before it starts reducing it. But based on our model and our economic model, economic conditions suggest that the interest rate of the bank could start decreasing in April. But in our model, we also anticipate inflation to return to 2% by the end of the current calendar year.
Great. Well, that was my next question about those interest rates, because of course everyone's very much paying attention to that as well. And maybe perhaps I'll pick up where Ms. Vignola left off around carbon pricing. Should we,